is for me a great privilege. Friends, I can't possibly talk about the challenges facing the Jewish world, but I just want to give you a brief insight into a couple of them. And let me begin with a story which actually happened and which was very, very flabbergasting at the time. Here it is. Around September 1999, our office received a call from the professor of medieval history at Boston University, one Professor Richard Landis. And he asked whether he could please have an appointment to meet the chief rabbi. He had something extremely urgent to tell him. I was so intrigued as to what possibly could be urgent about medieval Jewish history. I was enthralled, so I said, let's meet, and we met. And the story he had to tell me was just remarkable. Here it was. It turns out that Professor Landis is a specialist in millenarian movements. Millenarian movements, as you know, were sort of basically Christian Mashiach now type movements, of which there were many in the Middle Ages, the Hussites and the Ranters and the Levelers and all these things. And of course, with the year 2000 coming up, it was a natural time to expect millenarian movements. And his study of millenarian movements had yielded the following law, that before every expected millennium, there is a wave of philo-Semitism. And after every millennium, a wave of anti-Semitism. And he was sure that it was going to happen this time. The only thing he wasn't sure about was how. And this was his guess. If you remember at that time, 4 or 5 months before the millennium, there was an enormous worry about something called the millennium bug. Do you remember Y2K? And so his guess was, like everyone else, that come January the 1st, 2000, all the computers would crash, there'd be total chaos, especially in the skies and air traffic control, and somehow or other, he wasn't quite sure how, everyone would blame the Jews. That was his best working hypothesis. Well, December 31st, January 1st, 2000 came and went. We weren't able to do a great deal about it. As you know, remember, it was a Friday night Shabbos, although it did give us a chance of a wonderful little gesture of solidarity. A couple of months before, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, said, Jonathan, I know it's not your thing, but we'd love you to share with us in the celebration of the millennium. Do you think there's some way we could do this? He said, for instance, we're asking all of our members to light a candle for the millennium. I said, George, we'll go one better, we'll light 2. Anyway, obviously, the millennium came and it went and it was Shabbos, so we really didn't know. So I went out to see the world on the 1st of January 2000, and Olam Keminhago Noheg, the world continued on its accustomed course. The millennium bug, as you know, was a figment of somebody's imagination. And the result was that I turned to my wife, Elaine, and said, Landis got it wrong. And then came September 29, 2000, the collapse of the peace process in the Middle East and the beginning of the so-called Al-Aqsa Intifada, and then August 2001 with that notorious United Nations conference against racism at Durban, which saw the launch of a new and virulent form of racism, or at least anti-Semitism, and I'll say a few words about that in a moment. And then a week later, 9/11, and within 2 days, a survey done by the Wall Street Journal of Public Opinion in Pakistan showed that at least 70% of the Pakistani public was convinced that the Israelis had done it. And I turned to Elena and I said, Landis got it right. That was a long time ago, and the last 9 years have confirmed all of our fears. The world has changed for Jews. In 2000, you remember, Israel was launched on a peace process, standing high in the opinion of the world. The Jewish community throughout the world had record levels of achievement, integration, and success. Anti-Semitism was at an all-time low. And since then, difficult things have happened. V'navahu, the world, the Jewish world, has been transformed, in particular by 3 phenomena. Number 1, the return, horrific to say, of a new strain of anti-Semitism. Number 2, the progressive and continuing international isolation of Israel. And number 3, our own internal problems within the Jewish community, not just here in Britain, but globally, in the diaspora, on average, sometimes a little less, sometimes a lot more, but on average, 1 young Jew in every 2 is deciding not to marry another Jew, not to create a Jewish home, not to have Jewish children, not to continue the Jewish story. And those are the major challenges. And obviously, I'm only going to skim the surface tonight, but I did write a book on all of this. It was my most recent book called Future Tense. So that deals with all the issues tonight. I'm only going to look at just 2 of them. And I want to share with you my own concern. Having been on the front line of the fight against well, we've all been on the front line. I mean, this is not me, we all are, of the fight against anti-Semitism, the making the case for Israel, and the fight for Jewish continuity. As I wander through the Jewish world, have been very struck at the way that not all Jewish responses have been terribly effective. And these have puzzled me. And this is why I wrote Future Tense, not only to go through the problems one by one, but also to say that I think there is something systemic, something that we're getting wrong, something fundamental that generates responses that are not always effective. And how can I possibly explain this to you except by way of a story? And here it is. This is my favorite Jewish joke of all time. I share it with you. We were stuck in New York by the volcanic cloud just a couple of weeks ago, so it all came flooding back. This Jewish restaurant on a very humid summer's evening in New York, Lower East Side, and one of the diners, a rather loud and not entirely civilized individual, slaps the waiter over and says, "Waiter, it's too hot in here, put the air conditioning on." The waiter goes out, comes back a few minutes later. 10 minutes later, he says, "Waiter, it's now too cold, turn the air conditioning off." The waiter goes out. A few minutes later, he calls him over a 3rd time. "Waiter, it's too hot again, turn the air conditioning on." And as the waiter is about to go out for the 3rd time, a man just by the door says, "Waiter, I feel so sorry for you. This man must be driving you mad." And the waiter says, "Well, no, actually, I'm driving him mad. You see, there is no air conditioning." And this joke was enough to tell me that sometimes the climate in here matters as much as the climate out there. And now I am going to tell you the moment when I suddenly realized that the climate in here was all wrong. The date, Shavuos 2001. We are in Jerusalem, the best place by far to celebrate Shavuot. We are having lunch with a former leader of diaspora Jewry who'd made Aliyah, together with a very fine leader of Canadian Jewry, former Justice Minister of Canada, Owen Kotler, one of the world's great fighters against anti-Semitism, and a very distinguished Israeli diplomat, and we were having lunch. And Owen and I were sharing notes about the forthcoming United Nations conference in Durban,